Every computer science textbook credits Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, a 17th-century German mathematician, as the inventor of the binary system that powers every digital device you own. Your phone, your laptop, the entire internet, all of it runs on zeros and ones. And we're told this concept emerged from European mathematical genius in the 1600s. But here's what they don't teach you. 5,000 years before Leibniz was born, West African priests were using an identical binary system to encode, store, and retrieve vast quantities of information through the Ifa divination tradition. Not a primitive superstition, not a simple fortune-telling game. A sophisticated information technology that uses base 2 mathematics to generate, catalog and cross-reference 256 distinct data units, each connected to verses containing history, medicine, astronomy, and cultural knowledge. The system is so mathematically advanced that when computer scientists finally examined it in the 20th century, they found it perfectly analogous to 8-bit computer processing. This isn't coincidence. This is a fully functional computing system developed by African mathematicians thousands of years before the Western world claimed to invent it. And the reason you've ever heard about it is because acknowledging African innovation in digital logic would destroy the narrative that positioned Africa as technologically backward and in need of Western intervention during the very decades when the digital revolution was reshaping global power. In the mid-20th century, as the first digital computers were being developed in university laboratories across America and Europe, the entire African continent was being systematically excluded from technological advancement. Colonial powers were either still directly controlling African nations or had recently withdrawn, leaving behind economic structures designed to extract resources, not to foster innovation. When the personal computer revolution began in the 1970s and 80s, Africa was categorized as a consumer market, not a creator. The narrative was clear. Digital technology was a Western achievement. Born from Western mathematical traditions, and African nations would need to purchase, import, and adopt these technologies if they wanted to participate in the modern world. This wasn't just economic policy, it was ideological warfare. By controlling the story of where digital technology came from, Western institutions controlled who was seen as capable of innovation and who was relegated to perpetual dependency. But the exclusion required erasing an inconvenient truth. The binary system that Leibniz formalized in 1679 wasn't a novel European invention. It was a rediscovery of mathematical principles that had been encoded in the Ifa divination system for millennia. The Yoruba people of West Africa, whose cultural influence spans modern-day Nigeria, Benin, and Togo, had developed a knowledge management system so sophisticated that it required 8-bit binary notation to function. Each Ifa divination session generates one of 256 possible figures called Odu, created by casting 16 palm nuts or a divining chain 4 times to produce 4 binary pairs. These 256 Odu are not random symbols. Each is a unique identifier for vast bodies of oral literature, containing thousands of verses covering everything from agricultural practices to conflict resolution, from astronomical observations to herbal medicine. The system is self-correcting, cross-referenced, and expandable. It is, in every meaningful sense, a database architecture. And it was operating in Africa while Europe was still centuries away from developing formal mathematical logic. The stakes of this erasure are not merely historical, they are contemporary. By denying Africa's foundational contributions to information technology, the Western world has justified decades of digital colonialism in which African nations are sold technology they were told they could never create, locked into dependency on systems they were perfectly capable of developing themselves. The Ifa divination system is not some obscure cultural practice known only to specialists. It is one of the most widespread and enduring knowledge systems in West Africa, practiced by millions of people and recognized by UNESCO as a masterpiece of the oral and intangible heritage of humanity. At its core, Ifa operates through a binary randomization process that generates one of 256 possible configurations. The diviner, called a Babelo, uses 16 palm nuts held in one hand and attempts to grasp them with the other. Depending on whether 1 or 2 nuts remain, a single mark or a double mark is made in wood dust spread on a divination tray. This process is repeated 8 times, creating 8 binary digits, each of which can be either 1 or 2, represented as single or double marks. These 8 positions create a unique pattern, one of 256 possible combinations, which corresponds to one of the 256 Odu. The mathematics here are not approximate or symbolic. They are exact. 8 binary positions with 2 possible states each yield 2 to the 8th power, which equals 256 possible outcomes. This is identical to an 8-bit byte, the fundamental unit of computer memory. Each Odu functions as an address in a database, pointing to specific bodies of knowledge that have been memorized by trained priests over years of study. The Odu are not simple fortune-telling messages. They are complex literary compositions called E's, poetic verses that encode historical events, medicinal formulas, ethical teachings, and practical advice. A single Odu can contain hundreds of verses, and an experienced Biblio may have memorized thousands of verses across multiple Odu, creating a living library of cultural information. The system includes error-checking mechanisms. If divination seems unclear, the Biblio can perform additional casts to narrow the interpretation or verify the result. There are even meta-level Odu that provide guidance on how to interpret other Odu, creating a hierarchical information architecture remarkably similar to nested programming functions. The first Western scholar to recognize the mathematical sophistication of Ifa was William Bascom, an anthropologist who studied Yoruba culture in the 1960s and documented the binary structure of the system in academic publications. But Bascom presented it as an interesting cultural curiosity, not as a technological achievement. It wasn't until 1981 that the connection to computer science became explicit. Cuban mathematician and philosopher José Argüelles published work noting the structural similarities between Ifa and binary computing. Shortly after, Sophie Al-Wool, a Nigerian philosopher, began arguing forcefully that Ifa represented a complete system of symbolic logic and information management predating European formal logic. Oowal pointed out that the IFO system includes principles analogous to Boolean algebra, the mathematical foundation of digital circuit design. The casting process generates binary states. The interpretation process uses logical operators to combine and evaluate these states. And the output is deterministic information retrieval from a structured knowledge base. This is not divination in the mystical sense, this is data processing. When European colonizers first encountered the IFA system in the 19th century, they dismissed it as primitive superstition. Missionaries described it as devil worship and actively worked to suppress its practice. Colonial administrators saw it as an obstacle to modernization and attempted to replace it with Western education and Christian religious practice. But the suppression wasn't just religious intolerance. It was intellectual theft followed by denial. European anthropologists documented the system extensively, filling notebooks and publishing papers about its structure, yet they never acknowledged it as mathematics or technology. It was always presented as folklore, as belief, as culture, never as science. This framing was deliberate. To acknowledge that Africans had developed sophisticated mathematical systems would have undermined the entire justification for colonialism, which rested on the claim that Africans were intellectually inferior and needed European guidance to advance. The most damning evidence of deliberate erasure comes from examining what happened when the connection between Ifa and binary computing became undeniable in the late 20th century. In 1981, the same year, Argüelles published his work on Ifa's binary structure. IBM was launching the personal computer that would define the next decade of computing. Computer science was becoming a major academic discipline, and the history of computing was being codified in textbooks. These textbooks universally credited Leibniz with inventing binary notation, often including the story of how he was inspired by the Chinese I Ching, another ancient binary system. The I Ching receives acknowledgement, at least as an inspiration, because it comes from Chinese civilization, which Western academia had already grudgingly accepted as having produced sophisticated mathematics. But Ifa, despite being mathematically identical and arguably more complex in its application, receives no mention. It's not as an inspiration, not as a parallel development, not even as a footnote. This silence is especially striking because Leibniz himself, the man credited with inventing binary mathematics, had access to information about African divination systems. By the late 17th century, European scholars had published accounts of West African religious practices. including description of divination systems using marked objects to generate patterns. Leibniz was a voracious reader who consumed reports from travelers, missionaries, and traders. Yet there is no record of him ever acknowledging African mathematical systems, despite acknowledging Chinese inspiration. The omission becomes even more suspicious when you consider that Leibniz was actively seeking evidence of binary thinking in other cultures to validate his own work. He corresponded with Jesuit missionaries in China specifically because he had heard about the I Ching and wanted to learn more. If he had similar information about West African binary systems, and there's circumstantial evidence he might have, he chose not to pursue it. Why? Because African knowledge had no prestige value in European academic circles. Chinese civilization, despite European prejudices, had already established itself as ancient and sophisticated. African civilization was being actively denied that status by the same European scholars who might have documented its achievements. The mathematical proof of IFA's equivalence to digital computing is not controversial among those who have actually studied the system. Ron Eglish, a mathematician and cybernetics professor who has extensively researched African mathematical systems, has demonstrated that Ifa uses not just binary notation, but also algorithmic thinking, cursive patterns, and even concepts analogous to debugging and error correction. Eglish's work, published in peer-reviewed journals and presented at academic conferences, shows that the IFA system exhibits fractal geometry in its organizational structure, with each level of ODU interpretation containing self-similar patterns at different scales of complexity. This is advanced mathematical thinking that Western mathematics didn't formally describe until the 20th century, yet it was embedded in IFA structure for thousands of years. The linguistic evidence further supports the case for Ifa as a genuine information technology. The Yoruba language contains specific technical vocabulary for discussing the Ifa system that demonstrates abstract mathematical thinking. Words exist for concepts like pattern completion, logical consistency, and information density. These are not mystical terms. They are technical terms describing computational processes. The training of a Babelio, which can take decades, involves not just memorization, but also learning interpretive frameworks for applying the verses to new situations, essentially programming the human mind to function as an adaptive database query system. The Babelio must learn to recognize patterns, identify relevant verses, combine information from multiple sources, and generate novel solutions to problems. This is not rote memorization. This is training in algorithmic thinking and information processing. Perhaps the most compelling evidence comes from practical demonstration. In the 21st century, several computer scientists have created digital implementations of the IFA system, programming computers to generate ODU and retrieve associated verses from databases. These implementations work flawlessly because the underlying logic is already computational. The system doesn't need to be adapted or translated into computer logic. It already is computer logic. One such project, created by Nigerian software engineer Kola Tubasun, had demonstrated that an IFA database could be queried using the same principles as any modern information retrieval system. With binary keys generating deterministic outputs from a structured knowledge base, the code required to implement this was remarkably simple, precisely because the IFA system had already solved the fundamental problems of information: organization, retrieval, and interpretation, centuries before computer science claimed to invent them. The historical record also reveals that African societies using Ifa and similar systems demonstrated sophisticated information management in practical applications. The Yoruba kingdoms maintained complex administrative systems, managed extensive trade networks, and preserved detailed historical records across generations, all without written language in the Western sense. The knowledge was encoded in oral verse, indexed through binary divination figures, and transmitted through intensive training. This is distributed database architecture implemented through human memory and symbolic logic. It functioned effectively for thousands of years, proving that the underlying mathematical principles were sound. And yet, when European colonizers encountered these societies, they described them as primitive and lacking in systematic knowledge, despite the evidence of sophisticated social organization that such knowledge systems had enabled. So let's circle back to the question we started with. Why does every computer science textbook credit Leibniz with inventing binary notation while completely ignoring a mathematically identical system that predates him by thousands of years? Because acknowledging Ifa as a precursor to digital computing would fundamentally disrupt the narrative of technological progress that positions the West as the source of innovation and Africa as the recipient of aid. It would mean admitting that African mathematicians had solved problems in information theory millennia before Western scholars even recognized those problems existed. And it would mean confronting the reality that Africa's exclusion from the digital revolution was not due to lack of capability, but due to deliberate marginalization by powers that benefited from maintaining technological monopolies. The erasure of Ifa from the history of computing is not ancient history. It has direct contemporary consequences. When African nations are told they need to import digital infrastructure to license software from Western corporations to send their students abroad to learn computer science, the underlying message is that these technologies are foreign to African culture and beyond African capacity to create. But that's a lie. The foundational logic of computing is African. The binary system that powers every digital device was understood and applied in West Africa, while Europe was still arguing about whether zero was a real number. African exclusion from the digital economy was not inevitable. It was engineered. And recognizing Ifa as the true precursor to computer programming isn't just about correcting history. It's about reclaiming the future. Because when African innovators understand that their ancestors invented the logical foundations of the technology that now dominates the world, it changes what they believe is possible. It transforms the narrative from catching up to reclaiming what was always theirs. Now that you know the truth, you can never look at your computer the same way again. The zeros and ones flowing through its circuits aren't a European invention. They're an African innovation, encoded in divination figures for thousands of years before anyone called it digital technology. This is history rewritten, where we expose how the past was stolen to control the future. Subscribe, because the lies are bigger than you think, and the truth is more empowering than they ever wanted you to know.